October 17, 1944. Bushy Park, London. Major Martin Herz stared at Prisoner Interrogation Report 47B, his fountain pen trembling slightly as he read the German soldier's testimony for the third time. The morning rain drummed against the windows of the Psychological Warfare Division headquarters, a converted administrative building that smelled of cigarette smoke, mimeograph ink, and desperation. Unteroffizier Klaus Werner, 256th Volksgrenadier Division, had surrendered at 08:47 hours that morning to elements of the Third Army near Metz. He'd walked forward through artillery fire with his hands raised high, clutching a single piece of paper like a drowning man clutches driftwood. The paper was coded ZG-61, a safe conduct pass bearing General Eisenhower's signature in black ink. Werner had carried it sewn into the lining of his tunic for 6 weeks, checking daily to ensure it remained intact, dry, readable. His interrogator, Lieutenant James Morrison, had asked the standard question, "Why did you keep this leaflet?" Werner's answer was devastating in its simplicity. "Because it might save my life." Herz set down his pen and reached for his coffee, now cold. He'd joined PWD Schaff 3 months earlier, a refugee from Vienna who'd fled after the Anschluss in 1938. His German was native fluent, his understanding of German psychology intimate and profound. He knew what that leaflet represented to Werner, not just words on paper, but a psychological exit from an impossible situation. In October 1944, American and British prisoner interrogators had documented that 77% of captured German soldiers had read one or more Allied leaflets. 77%. That statistic appeared in official reports, classified briefings, strategic assessments. What Herz held in his hands wasn't just another interrogation report. It was proof that psychological warfare worked, that paper could kill armies as surely as bombs. But 6 weeks earlier, Werner had been a different man, a soldier in a Wehrmacht division being ground down by Allied firepower, watching friends die, seeing supply lines collapse, hearing promises from Berlin that rang increasingly hollow. The leaflet had arrived on a cold September night, floating down from a B-17 bomber 12,000 feet above his position. It landed in mud near his foxhole, red ink standing out against brown earth. Werner had stared at it for 5 minutes before picking it up, a capital offence according to Wehrmacht regulations. He'd read it by matchlight, hands cupped around the flame. Then he'd sewn it into his tunic lining and waited for the right moment. That moment came 6 weeks later, when American artillery began pounding his position with mathematical precision, when ammunition ran out, when the last ration arrived 3 days late and consisted of black bread and ersatz coffee. Werner walked forward carrying that leaflet like a passport to survival. The numbers told a story that contradicted every assumption about modern warfare. Between September 1944 and May 1945, the Psychological Warfare Division of Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force would drop nearly 6 billion leaflets over northwestern Europe. 6 billion. That's approximately 1,000 leaflets for every German soldier in the field. The Anglo-American leaflet operation consumed more than 80% of Britain's entire offset printing capacity by May 1945. 80% of an industrialized nation's printing capabilities, diverted to producing paper weapons. The 8th Air Force dedicated an entire squadron, the Special Leaflet Squadron, formerly the 422nd Bomber Squadron, exclusively to dropping paper over enemy lines instead of bombs. The unit flew modified B-17 bombers, stripped of defensive armament, loaded with 500,000 leaflets per mission instead of high explosives. Fighter pilots complained about wasting men transporting bump when they could be conducting combat missions. Many frontline commanders viewed leaflets with skepticism bordering on contempt, seeing psychological warfare as a rear echelon fantasy disconnected from battlefield reality. But the German High Command didn't share that skepticism. They knew something Allied pilots didn't, something that terrified them. Psychological warfare was working with devastating effectiveness. German military regulations mandated immediate reporting of any Allied leaflet to military police. Soldiers found with leaflets faced court-martial, imprisonment, even execution for undermining military morale. For concentration camp prisoners working near front lines, picking up a leaflet meant death on the spot, no trial, no questions. The Nazis understood that ideas could destroy armies just as surely as artillery. They'd built an entire propaganda apparatus under Joseph Goebbels, precisely because they knew the power of manipulating belief, controlling narrative, shaping perception. Now that weapon was being turned against them with precision and scale they couldn't match. The genesis of Allied psychological warfare began not in 1944 but decades earlier, in the muddy trenches of World War I. Between August 28 and November 11, 1918, American forces under Captain Heber Blankenhorn distributed approximately 5.1 million propaganda leaflets to German and Austrian forces. Over 3 million were successfully disseminated, mainly through airplane drops and hydrogen balloons. The psychologic subsection, established in the War Department on January 23, 1918, studied the psychologic factor in the strategic situation. These early efforts contributed to the erosion of German morale in the war's final months, helping precipitate the armistice. But they lacked coordination, funding, and presidential support. Woodrow Wilson gave psychological operations only token recognition, viewing them with suspicion. Between the wars, institutional knowledge evaporated like morning fog. No psychological warfare office existed at the War Department whatsoever. The techniques, the insights, the lessons learned, all lost to budget cuts and organizational indifference. The pioneering work of Blankenhorn and his team disappeared into filing cabinets and forgotten after-action reports. When World War II erupted in Europe in 1939, America possessed exactly 0 dedicated psychological warfare capability. When Germany invaded Poland, when France fell, when Britain stood alone, America had no doctrine, no trained personnel, no institutional memory. The scramble to rebuild began on July 11, 1941, when President Roosevelt created the Office of the Coordinator of Information under Colonel William Donovan. This hybrid intelligence and propaganda entity would eventually split into 2 separate organizations: the Office of Strategic Services, focused on espionage and covert operations, and the Office of War Information, handling psychological warfare and public information. The British, meanwhile, had established the Political Warfare Executive, a sophisticated propaganda agency drawing on centuries of imperial experience in managing subject populations. 3 separate agencies, OSS, OWI, PWE, 2 nations, 1 theoretically shared mission. The reality was bureaucratic chaos, competing priorities, and inevitable friction. The turning point came November 8, 1942, when Allied forces landed in French North Africa for Operation Torch. General Dwight Eisenhower, commanding Allied Force Headquarters, immediately recognized a problem. Nobody knew how to talk to enemy soldiers, liberated civilians, or neutral populations. On October 27, 1942, Eisenhower created the Psychological Warfare Branch attached to Allied Force Headquarters. He tapped Brigadier General Robert Alexis McClure to lead it. McClure was 45 years old, born in Mattoon, Illinois on March 4, 1897. He'd graduated from Kentucky Military Institute in 1915, joined the Philippine Constabulary as a third lieutenant, earned a regular army commission on August 9, 1917. He'd served in China with the 15th Infantry Regiment, secured rail access between ports during post-WWI instability. He'd spent 17 years as a captain. Promotion was glacially slow between the wars. He was an expert horseman, winning multiple Georgia horse show competitions while instructing at Fort Benning. He'd served as military attaché in London in 1941, watching the Blitz firsthand, understanding British resolve and German brutality. When Eisenhower needed someone to build a psychological warfare capability from scratch, McClure was the obvious choice. Pragmatic, experienced, unafraid of unconventional methods. McClure's information and censorship section in North Africa started with nothing. No leaflet printing capacity. No trained writers who understood psychological operations. No distribution methods beyond commandeering occasional bomber missions. McClure and his staff learned through trial and error, making mistakes that cost lives and taught lessons. Early leaflets were patronizing, politically naive, culturally tone-deaf. They preached democracy to soldiers who wanted food. They promised abstract freedom to men desperate for concrete survival. German and Italian soldiers used them as toilet paper, dismissing Allied propaganda as laughable. By November 13, 1943, McClure's operation had matured enough that Eisenhower promoted him to Chief of the Publicity and Psychological Warfare Division in London. 3 months later, in February 1944, the division became G6, a full-staff directorate at Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. On April 13, 1944, Eisenhower split G6 into 2 separate divisions. Brigadier General Thomas J. Davis headed publicity. McClure commanded the Psychological Warfare Division. P.W.D. Schaeff was born. McClure inherited a complex organization staffed by an unusual mix of soldiers, writers, artists, psychologists, and academics. Personnel came from the Office of War Information, the Office of Strategic Services, and the British Political Warfare Executive. By 1944, McClure's division employed over 700 personnel across multiple sections: intelligence, plans and directives, leaflet section, radio broadcasting, and field operations. They coordinated 12 high-powered radio stations broadcasting into German-held territory. They operated the Voice of Schaff, a daily radio program providing news and psychological appeals. They took over Radio Luxembourg, using its powerful transmitter to reach deep into Germany. They produced newspapers, magazines, posters, leaflets, an entire media empire dedicated to undermining enemy morale. But leaflets remained the largest single operation, largest in terms of continuing day-to-day production, largest in resource commitment, largest in potential impact. The first step toward coordination was establishing a joint layout, printing and production section serving both British and American agencies. By May 1945, when Germany surrendered, this joint operation utilized more than 80% of the United Kingdom's total offset printing capacity. Entire British printing firms converted to war production, running presses 24 hours daily. Specialized paper was sourced, ink formulations optimized for visibility and durability. The logistics rivaled ammunition production. Distribution was an even bigger challenge. The Special Leaflet Squadron of the 8th Air Force became the primary delivery mechanism. Operating from Chelveston Air Base in Northamptonshire, the squadron flew modified B-17 Flying Fortresses on nighttime missions. The aircraft had defensive armament removed to save weight and increase leaflet capacity. A typical mission loaded approximately 500,000 leaflets into each bomber. The leaflets were bundled and secured with paper bands designed to break at specific altitudes. Bombers would fly to predetermined coordinates, usually at night, to avoid German fighters. At designated altitudes, typically between 8,000 and 12,000 feet, crew members would open bomb bay doors. Bundles tumbled out, spinning through darkness. At prescribed altitudes, bands would break, leaflets would scatter, paper would rain across 10 to 15 square miles of German-held territory. The missions were dangerous, despite the non-combat designation. German night fighters still prowled. Anti-aircraft batteries still fired. Weather over northern Europe in winter was treacherous. Ice, fog, storms. Between 1944 and 1945, the 8th Air Force distributed 80% of all leaflets disseminated in Anglo-American operational areas. The Royal Air Force handled another 10%, flying similar missions from British bases. Fighter bombers from tactical air forces dropped 5% during combat missions, releasing leaflets alongside bombs. Artillery shells carried the final 5%, special munitions designed to burst and scatter leaflets over enemy trenches. Ground distribution was more dangerous, but more targeted. Mobile printing presses accompanied army groups at the front lines. These presses, mounted on trucks and powered by generators, could produce 50,000 leaflets per day under field conditions. The quality was lower than factory production, but the speed and relevance were unmatched. A German unit identified on Monday could receive customized leaflets by Wednesday. Artillery forward observers could call for leaflet fire missions, putting specific messages directly into enemy foxholes within hours. Loudspeaker teams represented the most intimate psychological warfare. Teams would position speakers facing German lines, sometimes only a few hundred yards away. They'd broadcast a mix of entertainment, news, and surrender appeals. Popular American music, Glenn Miller, Duke Ellington, Bing Crosby, to grab attention. Factual war news, Allied advances, German retreats, casualty figures, to establish credibility. Specific surrender instructions, how to approach safely, what to say, where to go, to enable action. The broadcasts would last 15 to 30 minutes, repeat several times, then fall silent. German soldiers huddled in frozen foxholes would hear these voices through the darkness, carrying messages their own officers couldn't contradict with facts. The leaflets themselves underwent constant evolution based on prisoner feedback. Early designs failed because they misunderstood German psychology. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source: captured German soldiers themselves. Interrogators began asking a simple question: what would have convinced you to surrender earlier? The answers revealed surprising patterns. Political ideology didn't matter. Speeches about democracy versus fascism fell flat. Grand promises about post-war Germany didn't resonate. Soldiers couldn't imagine surviving to see peace. What mattered was immediate survival, family back home, and certainty of inevitable defeat. This is where Martin Herz made his critical contribution. Born in Vienna, Herz had fled Austria when Nazis annexed it in March 1938. He'd watched friends disappear, seen businesses confiscated, felt the terror of totalitarian control. He spoke German like a native because he was native. He understood not just words but assumptions, fears, cultural touchstones. When Herz joined PWD Schaff in 1944, he brought invaluable insight, the ability to think like the enemy while working to defeat them. Herz reviewed hundreds of interrogation reports, looking for patterns. Themes emerged repeatedly: fear of Soviet captivity versus trust in Western treatment, desperate desire to see family again, respect for official documentation and formal procedure. The Soviets had already discovered emotional appeals worked. At Stalingrad, during the winter of 1942-43, Red Army leaflets featuring dead German soldiers with crying infants proved devastatingly effective. Soviet loudspeakers blared, "Every 7 seconds a German soldier dies. Stalingrad, mass grave." The psychological pressure, combined with starvation and frostbite, broke German morale. Soviet debriefings of captured Wehrmacht soldiers revealed the most psychologically impactful propaganda, referenced home, family and children, not politics or ideology. One German prisoner confessed, "Soldiers eagerly read Russian leaflets." Some cried when they saw a leaflet representing the corpse of a German soldier and an infant crying over it. But the Soviets made a critical strategic error. After Stalingrad, Stalin's propagandists pivoted to political messaging. Leaflets called for insurrection against Hitler, reformation within the Reich, socialist revolution. The messaging was written by exiled German communists and turned prisoners of war, people thoroughly hated by Wehrmacht soldiers. Berlin's counter-propaganda had an easy target: traitors and Jewish communists. Joseph Goebbels, Reich Minister of Propaganda, exploited these themes ruthlessly. German soldiers stopped reading Soviet leaflets, dismissed them as enemy lies written by race traitors. Psychological effectiveness plummeted just as the Eastern Front intensified. Herz and PWD Schaef colleagues learned from Soviet mistakes: no political messaging whatsoever, no grand ideological statements about democracy or freedom, no calls for Germans to overthrow Hitler. That would trigger immediate execution if discovered. Just facts: current military situation, specific surrender procedures, explicit promises of humane treatment. The leaflets would embody white propaganda, material that clearly identified its source and scrupulously told the truth. This was revolutionary in 1944. Standard propaganda doctrine emphasized deception, manipulation, psychological trickery. PWD Schaef did the opposite. They promised never to lie, and they kept that promise. Allied psychological warfare specialists operated under a cardinal rule: if caught in a single lie, the originator would lose all credibility forever, rendering future operations worthless. Every statistic had to be verifiable through multiple sources. Every claim about military situations had to be demonstrably true. Every promise about prisoner treatment had to be scrupulously honored. Breaking a promise to one prisoner would undermine leaflets being read by thousands of soldiers simultaneously. The concept of the safe conduct pass emerged from understanding German cultural psychology. Paul Leinbarger, a professor and psychological warfare theorist, identified the key insight in his seminal work, Psychological Warfare, published in 1948 but drawing on wartime experience. Germans, Leinbarger observed, liked things done in an official and formal manner, even in the midst of chaos, catastrophe, and defeat. They respected documents, seals, signatures, official stamps, formal declarations. A verbal promise from an enemy meant nothing, could be dismissed as battlefield trickery, but a document bearing national seals and a general's personal signature. That meant something profound in German administrative culture. The first safe conduct pass, coded ZG-21, was produced shortly after D-Day in June 1944. The design team included artists, printers, psychologists, and German-speaking refugees who understood the target audience intimately. The leaflet measured approximately 5 inches by 3.5 inches, small enough to fold and hide in a pocket, boot, or helmet liner. It was printed on quality paper, heavier stock than typical propaganda leaflets, giving it the feel of an official document rather than cheap propaganda. The first versions were printed in green ink. They featured the seal of the United States, the eagle with arrows and olive branch, and the British Royal Crest with lion and unicorn. The text was bilingual, German above, English below. The German text read: Der deutsche Soldat, der diesen Passierschein bei sich trägt, benutzt ihn als Zeichen seines ehrlichen Wunsches, sich zu ergeben. Er ist zu entwaffnen, gut zu behandeln, mit Nahrung und ärztlicher Betreuung zu versorgen, wie erforderlich, und sobald als möglich aus der Gefahrenzone zu entfernen. The English translation: The German soldier who carries this safe conduct is using it as a sign of his genuine wish to give himself up. He is to be disarmed, to be well looked after, to receive food and medical attention as required, and to be removed from the danger zone as soon as possible. The reverse side listed specific rights guaranteed under the Geneva Convention, but the first version had problems that only became apparent through prisoner interrogations. German soldiers were suspicious that the German text and English text might say different things. They didn't recognize Eisenhower's signature. His handwriting was illegible to Germans unfamiliar with English script. The green color faded into natural backgrounds, making dropped leaflets hard to find in forests, fields, and snow. The document didn't explicitly state whether it was valid for one soldier or could be shared among several. This is where PWD Schaef's commitment to continuous improvement paid dividends. Herz led teams conducting systematic prisoner interrogations, specifically about leaflet effectiveness. What did you see first when you found this leaflet? What made you believe it was genuine? What made you suspicious? What would have made you more likely to use it? Did you show it to comrades? Why did you keep it? Why did you surrender when you did? The answers informed 6 major revisions of the Safe Conduct Pass between June 1944 and March 1945. Version 2, coded ZG61 initial revision, moved German text above English, with an explicit note stating both texts were identical translations. This addressed trust issues. Soldiers could see the English text wasn't hiding different promises. Version 3 added Eisenhower's typed name below his signature: Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander, Allied Expeditionary Force. German soldiers recognized names typed in block letters, even if they couldn't read English handwriting. Version 4 changed the color from green to conspicuous red, making leaflets visible against snow, mud, and forest floors. Version 5 added a clarification line: valid for one or several bearers. German soldiers could share a single pass, removing the problem of multiple soldiers with only one leaflet. Version 6 expanded the reverse side with more detailed descriptions of prisoner rights: immediate removal from danger zones, decent treatment befitting soldiers, same food rations as American soldiers, full hospital care for wounded, postal privileges to write home, return to Germany after the war as soon as possible. Each revision was informed by hundreds of prisoner interviews conducted across multiple army groups. Interrogators would ask prisoners which version they'd found, what they'd thought when reading it, what they'd told other soldiers. The feedback loop was systematic, scientific, ruthlessly empirical. PWD Schaef treated psychological warfare as engineering: measure results, identify problems, test solutions, implement improvements, measure again. By autumn 1944, the 6th and final version, ZG61 Final Revision, achieved something remarkable in psychological warfare. It acquired the status of an official document in German military culture. German soldiers began treating these leaflets as legitimate orders from a superior authority. Captured soldiers would wave them at approaching American troops like white flags, shouting, "Passierschein! Passierschein!" Interrogators documented multiple cases of 3 German soldiers sharing a single leaflet, each clutching a corner as they walked forward together to surrender. One soldier told his American captors with evident pride that he possessed a document bearing General Eisenhower's personal signature. The reverence in his voice was unmistakable, remarkable. He'd fled his own army, violated his oath, walked toward enemy lines, and he viewed the leaflet as legitimizing that choice. The production and distribution statistics for safe conduct passes are staggering. Several 100 million were printed between September 1944 and May 1945. That's hundreds of millions of individual promises, each signed by Eisenhower, each guaranteeing specific treatment. The general understood the weight of his signature. If Allied forces violated those promises systematically, his signature would become worthless. The imperative to treat prisoners humanely wasn't just morality, it was operational necessity. Every broken promise destroyed credibility, undermined future leaflets being read by thousands of soldiers simultaneously. Reports from prisoner of war camps confirmed Allied forces were keeping promises. German prisoners received the same rations as American troops, more food than they'd seen in months. Wounded prisoners received immediate medical treatment, often better than German field hospitals could provide. Prisoners could write letters home through Red Cross channels. They were housed in barracks, not executed or tortured. When liberated prisoners returned to German lines through exchanges, they carried stories confirming the leaflets told truth. Those stories spread through Wehrmacht units faster than any leaflet could. But the Safe Conduct Pass was just one weapon in PWD's arsenal. The 1 Minute, 1-minute leaflet series, coded ZG45 and ZG84, represented a different psychological approach. These leaflets didn't offer a specific surrender pass. They presented cold logical arguments for why continued fighting was pointless. The opening line became famous among prisoners. "German soldier, we promise you neither utopia nor a paradise." This phrase appeared repeatedly in prisoner testimonies as influential in their decision to surrender. Why did it work? Because it was honest. German soldiers had been fed lies for years by their own government. Goebbels promised victory when defeat was obvious. Hitler promised wonder weapons, the V1, the V2, jet fighters, that would reverse the tide. Every promise proved hollow. Every prediction proved false. Every final victory receded further into impossibility. A leaflet that admitted limitations earned instant credibility precisely because it acknowledged difficulty. The 6 points of 1 Minute were brutally factual. 1. Germany has lost the war. The invasion succeeded. Allied armies advance on 3 fronts. Strategic bombing destroys German industry. 2. Your leaders systematically lied about Allied intentions. We do not seek to destroy the German people, only to defeat Nazi militarism. 3. Continued fighting only increases German casualties without changing the outcome. Every day you fight is another day of unnecessary death. 4. The military situation is strategically hopeless. Germany faces overwhelming material superiority from enemies who can replace losses indefinitely. 5. Surrender guarantees Geneva Convention protection. Your rights as a prisoner of war are specified and will be honoured. 6. You have 1 minute to decide between death and survival. Choose now. That final point was psychological genius, giving German soldiers a concrete time frame, 60 seconds, created urgency without panic. 1 minute was enough time to think, not enough time to overthink, to talk yourself out of survival. The psychological technique exploited decision fatigue. Soldiers who'd been contemplating surrender for weeks suddenly faced a deadline. The deadline forced choice. Another leaflet series targeted specific German units with customized psychological operations. ZG2 and ZG3 featured Wir Fronten Krieg, a map of Europe printed in red and black showing Germany menaced simultaneously by strategic bombing from above and armies advancing on 3 fronts: Western allies from France, Soviet armies from the east, Allied forces through Italy from the south. The visual impact was undeniable. Germany was surrounded, outnumbered, doomed. No text was necessary. The map communicated what words couldn't. There is no escape, no relief, no miracle coming. Some leaflets appealed to regional identity, exploiting the fact that Germany was a recent political construct overlaying much older regional identities. One famous leaflet specifically addressed a Swabian division fighting in France. The message appealed to the pride of the Swabians, arguing that real Swabian pride meant surviving to rebuild their homeland, not dying for a Prussian regime that had always looked down on South Germans. Regional targeting proved remarkably effective because it demonstrated intimate Allied knowledge of German military organization and cultural divisions. Soldiers realized the Americans and British knew exactly who they were, which unit, which region, what they valued. That level of intelligence was itself psychologically unsettling. Perhaps the simplest and most brilliant leaflet was the "I surrender" pass. The entire text, "This is the sound of the English and American words, I surrender. Make use of this if the opportunity arises." Below appeared phonetic German spelling designed for German pronunciation. I surrender. That was it. Nothing else on the entire leaflet except that single phrase and its pronunciation guide. The genius was in the problem it solved. Many German soldiers didn't know how to pronounce English surrender phrases. They'd had minimal English education, couldn't speak the language, feared mispronouncing a surrender attempt, and being shot by confused or hostile Allied soldiers. That fear, entirely rational, kept some from attempting surrender even when they wanted to quit. This leaflet removed that barrier entirely. Soldiers kept it specifically because knowing how to pronounce surrender might save their lives at the critical moment. The effectiveness of Allied leaflets can be measured through multiple quantitative and qualitative data points. The statistics are remarkable. In October 1944, 4 months after D-Day, American and British prisoner interrogators officially reported that 77% of captured German soldiers had read one or more Allied leaflets. 77% of prisoners had engaged with the propaganda. On the Brest Peninsula during its siege, approximately 80% of German prisoners had leaflets in their physical possession at the time of capture. They'd kept them in pockets, tucked in helmet liners, sewn into uniforms. In one documented incident on the Western Front, 44 men from the 256th Volksgrenadier Division deserted to a Third Army unit in a single day in late 1944. 44 men, nearly an entire platoon, walked away from their positions together. Nearly all carried safe conduct passes when they surrendered. Their testimony revealed they'd been discussing surrender for weeks, waiting for the right moment, encouraging each other. The leaflets had given them permission to choose survival over ideology. The qualitative testimonies provide even richer insight into psychological impact. A German major captured on the Western Front in February 1945 declared the Passierschein the most effective Allied leaflet I have seen. He elaborated, "If captivity was really as good as promised, it was much better to surrender than to fight on." The interrogator asked why he hadn't surrendered earlier. The major admitted he hadn't become a prisoner voluntarily. He'd been captured after his unit was overrun. But he'd kept the leaflet for 6 weeks before capture, checking it daily. That psychological preparation was everything. German soldiers sewed leaflets into uniform linings with threads scavenged from buttons. They tucked them into boots between sock and leather. They hid them in helmet liners, folded so small they were invisible to casual inspection. The risk of being caught with one was severe, court-martial, possible execution. Yet thousands did it anyway. Why? Because hope is more powerful than fear when you're losing. Because survival instinct overwhelms ideology when death is certain. Because when the alternative is freezing to death in a foxhole for a cause already lost, a piece of paper promising life becomes the most valuable thing in the world. The German High Command understood the existential threat leaflets represented. They produced sophisticated counter-propaganda specifically targeting the safe conduct pass. German intelligence services created counterfeit passes that reproduced Allied designs nearly perfectly. Same size, similar color, matching fonts. The crucial difference: German versions warned that any soldier surrendering would remain in captivity for 10 years minimum, probably never seeing parents, wife or children again. The fact that Berlin devoted intelligence resources and printing capacity to counterfeiting Allied leaflets proved their effectiveness conclusively. You don't counter something that doesn't work, you ignore it. Joseph Goebbels launched comprehensive propaganda campaigns emphasizing Soviet atrocities against German civilians, Allied strategic bombing destroying German cities, and the absolute necessity of fighting to the bitter end. His February 18, 1943, Total War speech at the Berlin Sportpalast was a masterpiece of emotional manipulation. His rhetoric exploited fears of Bolshevism, painted Allied intentions in the darkest terms, promised that fanatical resistance could still achieve victory. His propaganda was masterful, emotional, persuasive, but it couldn't overcome arithmetic. Numbers don't lie, and the numbers said Germany had already lost. By late 1944, German soldiers could see defeat with their own eyes. American artillery answered German fire in 3 minutes with overwhelming volume. P-47. Thunderbolts controlled the skies, strafing anything that moved. Supply lines were severed by Allied air power. Replacements never arrived. Winter clothing sat in warehouses hundreds of miles away, unreachable. Food rations shrank from inadequate to starvation level. Ammunition dwindled to rationing. 10 rounds per rifle, 2 magazines per submachine gun. Tanks sat immobilized for lack of fuel. Hospitals overflowed with wounded who would never return to combat. Allied leaflets didn't have to convince German soldiers they were losing. Soldiers already knew. The leaflets just had to provide an honorable way out, a mechanism for choosing survival over meaningless death. They provided psychological permission to quit. Survivor testimonies from death marches reveal the broader psychological impact beyond combat soldiers. Magda Fischer, a concentration camp prisoner being force-marched through mountains in early 1945, witnessed American planes flying low over their column. The planes dropped leaflets instead of bombs. Guards forbade prisoners from touching them on pain of immediate execution. Someone stole one anyway, risked death to see what it said. Fischer remembered. The leaflet said in many languages to the Germans to give themselves up. It gave us hope. Even for those who weren't soldiers, even for those who couldn't act on the message, even for those who would die before liberation, the leaflets represented something profound. The Allies were close. Liberation was coming. Survival was possible. The production statistics boggle the mind. By May 1945, PWD Chef had disseminated approximately 5,997,000 leaflets over northwestern Europe. 6 billion leaflets. If laid end to end, they would circle the Earth 3.7 times. If stacked, they would rise 137 miles into space. The Anglo-American leaflet operation utilized more than 80% of the United Kingdom's total offset printing capacity exclusively for months. Entire factories converted to leaflet production. Printing presses operated 24 hours daily, 7 days weekly. Paper supplies were diverted from book publishing, newspapers, even military manuals. Ink production prioritized psychological warfare. The industrial commitment rivaled ammunition production. The diversity of leaflets was equally impressive, reflecting sophisticated understanding of target audiences. Approximately 139 different ZG series leaflets targeted the German Wehrmacht directly. About 56 WG series leaflets targeted German workers and civilians. Roughly 27 VG series. Schaeff newspaper leaflets provided regular news updates. Each leaflet was carefully crafted for its specific audience and moment. Factory workers received messages about Allied respect for workers' rights. Combat soldiers received tactical surrender instructions. Officers received appeals to professional military judgment. Regional units received messaging leveraging local identities. The leaflets adapted to changing military situations with impressive speed. When the Ardennes offensive began on December 16, 1944, new leaflets appeared within 48 hours showing updated maps of German encirclement as the offensive stalled. When specific German units were isolated, like the garrison at Aachen, leaflets addressed those soldiers by unit designation and commander name. When Hitler Youth divisions entered combat in desperate 1945 battles, leaflets appeared appealing to their mothers, asking why 15-year-old boys should die for old men's mistakes. The psychological warfare operation responded to battlefield developments with the speed and relevance of modern news media. Mobile radio broadcasting companies represented the voice of psychological warfare. These units accompanied advancing armies, setting up powerful loudspeakers facing German lines. They'd broadcast carefully structured programs, popular music for attention, factual news for credibility, surrender appeals for action. A typical broadcast might include Glenn Miller's In the Mood to draw German soldiers to listen, followed by accurate reports of Allied advances verified by German radio intercepts. Then specific instructions on safe surrender procedures. German soldiers in frozen foxholes would hear American music they'd been told was degenerate, followed by news they suspected was true but couldn't verify, followed by offers of survival. One of the most sophisticated operations was Nachrichten für die Truppe, news for the troops. This 4-page leaflet newspaper was dropped continuously on German positions from April 25, 1944, until German capitulation on May 8, 1945. It provided factual war news written in straightforward, non-propagandistic German. No obvious propaganda, no exaggerated claims, no bombastic rhetoric, just news. Allied armies captured X city on Y date, German forces retreated Z kilometers, civilian casualties from bombing totaled N people. The absence of obvious propaganda made it far more credible than German military briefings, which soldiers knew were systematically false. German soldiers began trusting Allied newspapers more than their own officers' situation reports. Another publication, Front Post, Front Postal Service, was produced by 12th Army Group and disseminated by fighter bombers and medium bombers. Front Brief, Front Letter, was published by 7th Army under field conditions using mobile printing presses. These newspapers served dual purposes. They informed German soldiers of military realities they couldn't deny, and they demonstrated Allied confidence. Only a side certain of victory prints newspapers for the enemy. Only a military machine with resources to spare dedicates bombers to delivering news. The psychological sophistication extended to visual design and imagery. Many leaflets featured photographs carefully selected for emotional impact. Captured German soldiers receiving hot meals from American field kitchens, wounded prisoners receiving medical treatment from Allied doctors, prisoners writing letters home, prisoners smiling in clean barracks. The images showed reality. Allied treatment of prisoners was generally humane. but they were selected and composed for maximum psychological effect. One particularly effective series depicted prisoner of war menus: roasted chicken with vegetables, fresh bread, real coffee, fruit for dessert. For German soldiers subsisting on black bread and ersatz coffee made from acorns, for men who hadn't seen meat in weeks, these menus were more persuasive than any political argument. The Soviet Union had used similar tactics, adding images of prisoners eating and chatting with Russian officers. American leaflets went further, showing actual menu items with descriptions and portion sizes. The effectiveness of menu leaflets increased dramatically as German logistics collapsed in early 1945. One post-war US Army study from the 1950s found that leaflets targeted at children were unexpectedly successful. Children didn't know it was forbidden to read enemy propaganda. They picked up colourful leaflets and shared them with families. This created cascade effects: children to parents to soldiers at the front. German military police couldn't arrest children en masse without destroying civilian morale entirely. Toward the war's end, PWD chef encountered diminishing marginal returns with complex messaging. Soldiers were exhausted, hungry, cold, traumatized. They couldn't process sophisticated arguments. The most successful late-war leaflets had almost no text, just stark images and simple questions. ZG79K featured a simple question in large type: "Enemy propaganda. Bombs could have fallen from the plane that dropped this leaflet. Why does the enemy send you leaflets instead of bombs?" The answer below: "This leaflet has a message for you. It is supposed to save your life." 260,000 copies were dropped in November and December 1944. The psychological technique was brilliant: make the German soldier question why Americans were trying to save his life instead of kill him, force him to consider that maybe the enemy wasn't as monstrous as propaganda claimed. The final months saw truly desperate German defences. The Wehrmacht drafted children, 15-year-old Hitler Youth members given rifles and told to die for the fatherland. They conscripted grandfathers, 60-year-old Volkssturm members pulled from factories and given uniforms. They emptied concentration camps, forcing prisoners into uniform and sending them to die. They released criminals from prisons directly into combat units. These weren't soldiers. They were humans being fed into a meat grinder by leaders who refused to accept defeat. Leaflets targeting these groups emphasized they owed nothing to a regime that cynically exploited them. A 15-year-old boy conscripted into Hitler Youth had no obligation to sacrifice his life for Hitler's delusions. A 60-year-old grandfather had no reason to abandon his family for a lost cause, led by men who'd already sent his sons to die. A camp prisoner forced into uniform owed no loyalty whatsoever to captors who'd tortured him. These messages were morally unambiguous. You are being murdered by your own government. Survival is the only rational choice. The moral dimension of psychological warfare was debated even during the war. Some American and British officers argued it was unethical to encourage enemy soldiers to violate their oaths. The counter-argument? Every German soldier who surrendered was one less Allied casualty, one less German death, one more human surviving war's horror. Eisenhower himself signed the safe conduct passes, lending his personal authority and reputation to the promises made. He understood that if Allied forces systematically violated those promises, his signature would become worthless, undermining not just leaflet effectiveness, but Allied credibility broadly. The imperative to treat prisoners humanely wasn't just military necessity, it was a statement about Allied values in total war. After Germany's surrender, captured German documents revealed how seriously Berlin took the leaflet threat. Himmler's SS issued specific orders regarding leaflet discovery and disposal. any leaflet must be reported immediately, turned over to military police, never discussed with comrades. German officers conducted regular inspections, searching for hidden leaflets in uniforms, equipment, personal belongings. Wehrmacht courts-martial tried soldiers caught with safe conduct passes, handing down sentences ranging from imprisonment to execution. Yet the leaflets kept appearing, sewn into tunic linings, tucked into boots, hidden in helmet liners, folded so small they were virtually invisible. The harder Berlin tried to suppress them, the more valuable they became as symbols of hope. Post-war interviews with German survivors provided additional insights into long-term psychological impact. Many soldiers kept leaflets for weeks or months before circumstances allowed surrender. Some used them as bargaining chips when Soviet and American lines met, showing the pass to Americans to avoid Soviet captivity, which German soldiers feared far more than Western POW camps. Others kept them as psychological insurance even while continuing to fight, a reminder that an alternative existed, that choosing survival remained possible. The leaflet itself became a talisman, a symbol of hope, independent of its specific promises. The doctrine developed by PWD Schaff influenced psychological operations for decades. Korean War propaganda campaigns drew directly from WW and lessons learned. Vietnam psychological operations employed similar techniques with mixed success. Gulf War leaflet campaigns in 1991 resulted in approximately 87,000 Iraqi troops surrendering, many clutching coalition leaflets. The fundamental insight remained constant across conflicts. Psychological warfare works best against armies with shattered morale, facing inevitable defeat. Propaganda cannot create victory from defeat, but it can hasten an inevitable defeat, reduce casualties, save lives. The safe conduct pass doctrine had clear limitations. It was spectacularly ineffective when distributed to enemies with high morale. Early war German troops in 1940 were confident, victorious, ideologically committed, riding the wave of blitzkrieg success. Leaflets bounced off them harmlessly. They laughed at Allied appeals. They used leaflets as kindling. But by 1944, after Stalingrad, after North Africa, after Normandy, after watching the Reich crumble, German morale had fractured fundamentally. Men who'd believed in final victory now believed only in survival. The leaflets didn't create that despair. They channeled it toward a specific action: surrender. The success rate is impossible to calculate with precision. How many soldiers surrendered specifically because of leaflets versus exhaustion, fear, lack of ammunition, or isolation? The variables are too complex, too intertwined to isolate causation definitively. But the testimonial evidence is overwhelming and consistent. Thousands of German prisoners specifically cited leaflets as influential, often decisive, in their decision to quit fighting. The 77% readership rate among prisoners is statistically extraordinary. 3/4 of captured soldiers had engaged with enemy propaganda. That German major, who called the Passierschein the most effective Allied leaflet, revealed something crucial. He'd kept it, despite not surrendering voluntarily. He was eventually captured in combat after his position was overrun. But he'd preserved the leaflet for 6 weeks before that capture. That psychological preparation, that acceptance of possible surrender, fundamentally affected battlefield behavior. Soldiers who'd contemplated surrender were more likely to surrender quickly when circumstances forced the choice, rather than fighting to death. They'd already rehearsed the decision mentally through repeated exposure to the leaflet. The I surrender phonetic pronunciation leaflet revealed another profound truth. Barriers to surrender are often practical rather than ideological. Give a soldier the words to surrender, and he'll use them when the moment comes. Remove the fear of being shot because of mispronounced English, and surrender becomes thinkable, feasible, achievable. Small obstacles prevent massive changes in behavior. Removing tiny barriers cascades into enormous effects. The finest achievement of PWD Schaff was maintaining credibility through scrupulous honesty. We promise you neither utopia nor a paradise. That single sentence accomplished more than 1,000 exaggerated claims. It acknowledged reality candidly. Captivity would be difficult, boring, restrictive, far from home. But it wouldn't be death. For a soldier in a frozen foxhole with dwindling ammunition, facing Soviet armies from the east and American firepower from the west, with no supplies coming and no reinforcements arriving, boring captivity sounded like paradise. The leaflet campaign's greatest success might have been completely invisible, unknowable, impossible to measure. How many German commanders surrendered entire units because they'd been psychologically prepared by months of leaflet exposure? How many battles were avoided because German forces melted away rather than fighting to annihilation? How many Allied soldiers came home alive because German soldiers chose surrender over suicidal resistance? The lives saved can't be counted precisely. But every German division that quit a week earlier was a week of Allied casualties prevented. Every German regiment that surrendered instead of fighting represented hundreds of young men, American, British, Canadian, who lived instead of dying. April 23, 1945, 12th Army Group Headquarters, Germany. Major Martin Herz reviewed the final production statistics with quiet satisfaction that bordered on exhaustion. Nearly 6 billion leaflets distributed across Europe, hundreds of millions of safe conduct passes bearing Eisenhower's signature, 77% readership among prisoners, entire divisions surrendering with leaflets clutched in hand, thousands of testimonies crediting leaflets with survival decisions. The war in Europe had 15 days remaining. On May 8, 1945, Germany would surrender unconditionally. The leaflets had done their work. They hadn't won the war. Allied armies had done that through blood, courage, material superiority, and sacrifice. But the leaflets had saved lives by convincing thousands of German soldiers that surrender was honourable, achievable, and survivable. They'd proven that paper could be as powerful as steel when wielded with precision, honesty, and sophisticated psychological understanding. In the decades since, historians have debated the true effectiveness of psychological warfare endlessly. Some dismiss it as marginal, arguing that battlefield realities determined outcomes regardless of propaganda. Others credit psychological operations with hastening Germany's collapse by months, potentially saving hundreds of thousands of lives. The truth, as usual, lies between extremes. Leaflets alone couldn't force surrender. Paper alone couldn't defeat armies. But, combined with overwhelming military pressure, shattered logistics, collapsing morale, and the clear inevitability of defeat, leaflets provided the final psychological push thousands of soldiers needed to choose survival over death. The Safe Conduct Pass represented something profound about the nature of warfare and humanity. It embodied the idea that enemies are human beings capable of rational choice, even in extremity. German soldiers weren't mindless fanatics or ideological automatons. They were men who wanted to survive, see their families, rebuild their lives after catastrophe. Give them an honourable way out, and many will take it. Treat them with dignity upon surrender, and others will follow their example. Break promises, and the weapon becomes worthless instantly. The legacy of PWD Schaff's leaflet campaign extends far beyond World War II. Every modern military psychological operations unit traces its doctrine, techniques and ethics to lessons learned between 1944 and 1945. The emphasis on truth over deception, the importance of understanding enemy psychology deeply, the power of official-looking documents in authoritarian cultures, the effectiveness of simple, clear messaging over complex propaganda, the absolute necessity of treating surrendering enemies humanely to encourage additional surrenders. These principles seem obvious now. They weren't obvious in 1942 when America had essentially zero psychological warfare capability. They were discovered through trial and error, through systematic interrogation of prisoners, through willingness to learn from the enemy himself. The brilliance of PWD Chef was institutional. They listened to what German prisoners said and adapted accordingly. Version 6 of the Safe Conduct Pass incorporated specific suggestions from German soldiers about what would make them more likely to trust and use it. The most effective Allied propaganda was partially designed by Germans. That humility, that willingness to learn from the enemy, was itself a kind of psychological warfare because it produced more effective weapons. Oberst Klaus Werner's testimony, recorded in Interrogation Report 47B on October 17, 1944, included a haunting observation that Herz couldn't forget. Werner had kept the Safe Conduct Pass sewn into his tunic for 6 weeks before using it. Every day he touched it through the fabric, feeling its presence. Every night he wondered if tomorrow would be the day. Every engagement he survived, he considered surrendering, but didn't. The leaflet didn't make him surrender immediately, but it made surrender thinkable. And once something becomes thinkable, it becomes possible. And once something becomes possible, it becomes probable under the right circumstances. The numbers tell one story: 6 billion leaflets, 77% readership, thousands of documented surrenders directly attributed to propaganda. But the human stories tell another, richer, more complex truth. 3 German soldiers clutching corners of a single leaflet because they'd agreed to surrender together. Children sharing forbidden papers with families, creating chains of influence across civilian society. A German major keeping a document for weeks in case it came in useful, never admitting, even to himself, that he'd already decided to survive. A dying teenager who never fired a shot because he read a menu promising hot meals and chose life over ideology. These stories don't appear in official histories or strategic assessments, but they're the real measure of success. The Psychological Warfare Division, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, ceased operations in July 1945. Its personnel returned to civilian life: writers, artists, psychologists, academics, soldiers. Its printing presses fell silent after months of 24-hour operation. Its aircraft returned to conventional missions or were scrapped in post-war demobilization. Its headquarters at Bushy Park became administrative offices again. The smell of mimeograph ink fading, but its legacy endured in doctrine, in lessons learned, in lives saved. The leaflets proved that warfare isn't purely physical, it's fundamentally psychological. Victory isn't just defeating enemy armies, it's convincing them that defeat is inevitable, that resistance is futile, that survival through surrender beats death in battle. Propaganda isn't lies and manipulation, or rather, the most effective propaganda is truth wielded with strategic precision and tactical sophistication. And sometimes, the most powerful weapon isn't a bomb or a bullet, but a promise printed on quality paper with a general's signature guaranteeing life over death. That promise, multiplied 6 billion times and scattered across a continent like seeds, hastened the end of the most destructive war in human history. It saved Allied lives by convincing enemies to quit fighting. It saved German lives by offering an alternative to meaningless death. It demonstrated that even in total war, humanity can prevail through appeals to reason, survival instinct, and hope. The Safe Conduct Pass wasn't just a leaflet, it was a philosophical statement. Even enemies deserve a chance to choose life. Even in the midst of industrialized slaughter on unprecedented scale, individual human lives matter. Even when armies clash and nations burn, a piece of paper promising dignity and survival can change everything. 77% of German prisoners had read the leaflets. That means 23% hadn't. We'll never know how many of that 23% died because they never saw a safe conduct pass. We'll never know how many might have surrendered if they'd known surrender was possible, honourable, survivable. We'll never know how many families lost fathers who would have walked forward with hands raised if only they'd seen that piece of red paper promising life. But we know this with certainty. Thousands who did read the leaflets chose survival. They walked forward with hands raised and papers held high toward enemy lines. They entered captivity rather than graves. They survived to return home when the war finally ended, to rebuild shattered lives, to tell their children about the piece of red paper bearing a general's signature that saved their lives. That's the final measure of the leaflet's success beyond statistics and operational reports. Not the 6 billion printed. Not the 77% readership rate. Not even the thousands of documented surrenders. But the men who lived because paper reached them before bullets did. The families reunited because words proved more powerful than weapons. The children born because fathers surrendered rather than died. The lives saved by people who understood that in war, the ultimate victory is survival. The leaflets that made thousands of German soldiers surrender weren't just propaganda. They were invitations to survival. And in a war that killed 70 million people, every invitation accepted was a small victory for humanity itself. A reminder that even in total war, even in industrialized slaughter, even in ideological struggle to the death, human life retains value. That some things, truth, dignity, mercy, remain possible even in hell. That paper and ink, deployed with intelligence and maintained with integrity, can save lives as surely as any weapon can take them. The legacy continues today in every military that employs psychological operations, in every conflict where leaflets still fall from aircraft, in every surrender that happens because someone chose to make that choice thinkable. The techniques evolved, the technology advanced, but the fundamental insight remains. The most powerful weapon in war might just be the belief that survival is possible, that surrender is acceptable, that choosing life over death is not cowardice, but wisdom. And sometimes, communicating that belief requires nothing more than 6 billion pieces of paper, scattered like hope across a continent at war, 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 continent at war.